Okay, welcome everybody to Phototech number 24. Today we have an interesting kind of two-part talk by Lance Williams, who's a Googler, Diego Rother, who's a Google intern from University of Minnesota. They're going to talk to us about quantization, dequantization, texture, super resolution, and interesting stuff like that. And we'll start with Lance.
Hi, thanks for coming. Diego Rother has been doing some interesting work on image texture this summer, and I thought that I would try to frame that and provide some history, some background for it, by describing some very old work that I was involved in. The vision of image texture that Diego is going to present has to do with kind of interpolating pixels. And there's another part of this that's really very important, which has to do with the structure of images, groups of pixels. Pixels are not uncorrelated because when we sample them, we usually insist on their being band limited. So I'm going to talk about some very low-level signal processing considerations that have to do with sampled images, and some work that was done at Apple quite a while ago. This work was presented at an IMA workshop in film restoration in February 2006, but it was the subject of an Apple patent that was filed in 1996. It's fairly evident when signal processing class develops the idea of sampling and reconstruction that the idea that time happens in discrete intervals is usually combined with the assumption at the outset that the samples themselves are continuous. That is to say that the samples of the signal have continuous values. And if that assumption is made, then the Nyquist reconstruction, sync reconstruction, is obviously correct. Usually the subject of quantization is introduced later, and it's introduced as a nonlinearity that can be characterized. Its effect on the signal can be characterized, but it can't be inverted. I think that if you consider quantization in the context of sampling and kind of develop these ideas in concert, you can achieve a kind of different understanding of quantization, and I think it's possible to get improved results in reconstructing quantized signals, and that's true across the board. Now, I'm presenting this is kind of forgotten lore. This is not something that it turns out that I discovered. Other people had observed it earlier. But it's not widely known. It's not widely appreciated, and I think it should be much more so. So, notionally, we have the idea of a sampled and quantized signal. At the top, you have a bunch of Dirac delta distributions that integrate to the value of the amplitude of the samples, and the samples are of a signal that might be a kind of a step or square wave sort of thing. But in the second panel, we show the quantization bounds for each of those samples. What we know about the signal at an instant in time is not some value that it's assumed, but rather a range of values that it passes through. So at the bottom, there's a hand-drawn signal that is smoother than the quantized step that just represents another signal that notionally might have passed through the same quantization bounds. And it's quite a bit different than a set of samples that are arbitrarily supposed to exist at the midpoint of the quantization range. So it's because of the way sampling theory is developed, you know, as a compromise on instantaneous continuous samples, that interpolation is the mode by which sample signals are reconstructed. In the ideal continuous case, it's obviously correct to interpolate the points. But these points that we've got in these quantization ranges aren't really points that the signal necessarily passed through. So in fact, we're enforcing constraints that represent things that we don't actually know about the signal. So I'm not going to represent that aliasing can be inverted. It cannot. But there's a dual way of understanding some of the phenomena that are associated with aliasing, and that is as quantization. If we parameterize the outline of this raster letter R and trace around it as a function of some independent parameter t that takes us around the perimeter, then we can divide the contour into x of t and y of t, and those outlines are clearly quantized to the raster boundaries. And what I've illustrated here is a smooth reconstruction which keeps the samples within their quantization bounds, but otherwise we're asking for the smoothest signal. And I think you'll agree that the R on the right is a more satisfactory R than the one on the left. It's also satisfying that it requantizes exactly to that outline. So this is an idempotent process. So what are we really doing here? Well, let's consider the interpolation case for a moment. Suppose we had a bunch of samples and we wanted to interpolate them. Well, that means we want to pass a curve through them. There are obviously an infinite number of possible curves that can pass through a set of points, so we select one by typically selecting an objective function that curve must satisfy. The objective function that's been used in the examples in these slides is the objective of the natural cubic spline, which is to minimize the integral of second derivative squared. It's not so easy to frame sync interpolation in these terms, but a lot of us, particularly those in graphics, are perfectly happy to represent things in terms of low-order polynomial splines. This is satisfactory for a lot of purposes. And we could imagine a sync-like interpolation of this contour that's certainly not difficult to envision, but the point here is that we can satisfy the objective of minimizing the integral of second derivative squared and observe only the constraint that we keep the points within the quantization bounds. We're doing exactly the same thing that we would be doing if we were interpolating the points. We're satisfying that objective, but we're just satisfying a different set of constraints. We're keeping the points inside their bounds instead of arbitrarily forcing them to interpolate a value at the midpoint of the quantization range, which is just, in my opinion, mistaken. So that's the 1D case, and there are a lot of 1D signals of interest. But this also applies in the bivariate case. This is an image of a picture of a sphere that's represented in 16 gray levels. And if we had this picture and wanted to reconstruct it with more gray levels, let's say we had 8 bits available, we could do that in the same way that we reconstructed the outline of the R. We can ask for the smoothest function that stays within the quantization bounds. Now, I don't know how visible they are on the screen here, but there are some artifacts attached to this reconstruction. Around the perimeter of the sphere, there's some kind of faint sort of halos radiating from the outline. And those artifacts are actually caused by the background of the sphere. In its unreconstructed form, that vertical ramp is a bunch of bars, and where those constant value bars hit the perimeter of the sphere, there's a little kind of ringing sort of artifact. And what's happening is that in trying to minimize the objective, we've got some points that, rather than being within the same quantization band, have many quantization levels apart. But the optimization still wants to pull this one down and push this one up. And that's what causes these artifacts. But having observed that, it's fairly clear what we'd like to do to fix this, which is we'd like to take the outline of this sphere and process it like the outline of the R. By creating a boundary wherever contrast edges exist, we can get this kind of smooth boundary, and we can get this kind of smooth interpolation. So that's a geometric re-representation of the sampled image. And it is kind of the limiting case of the sort of texture, the sort of structure that we need to interpolate texture in the ways that Diego is going to describe. We need some kind of structure for the boundaries of our different sort of structure, of our different pixel textures. The textures are correlated. We have to be able to cut those correlations with, by determining the sort of discontinuities that we've redrawn the outline of the R with. And in that case, we have a representation for image structure, image boundaries, and contours, and that we have an independent representation of the texture between those boundaries, and that is like a geometric recreation of the image, and it's got a lot of flexibility and power. I should mention that I discovered after devising the scheme that Avita Zakor had published it in Reducing Blocking Artifacts in Transform Image Coding. That was rather narrowly framed, so that's why it took me a while to find it. She used projection onto convex sets to achieve her result, and some other correspondents to the same IEEE transactions criticized that method and recommended constrained optimization instead. We use constrained optimization. Pete Lewinowitz wrote the thin plate spline routines with which these examples were realized. And despite the fact that there's some lore on this topic, I think that this is an underappreciated approach to reconstructing quantized signals. Thank you.
Okay. I will talk about my work that I did with Lance during the summer. Is it on? Yes. Okay, thanks. I can shout for a while if necessary. So I will talk about, okay, good idea. So I will talk about this work that we did during the summer and use it as an excuse to talk about some fundamental algorithms in image processing, in particular in texture synthesis and texture transfer. And you may wonder why this is there. That is there because, how many of you have seen this movie before? Okay, great. That is there because I felt that the best way to explain my work was to start from the end and go backwards, like in this movie. So, questions? So, these are textures that we generated. I will tell you later how. Just from those samples, we generated the movies that I'm going to show you. It's showing in my screen. There. So that is the original texture for generating that was asphalt, and it's the first frame that you see in the video. And using only that frame, this frame, we can generate all this movie by keeping the statistics of each frame constant. A different example is this one. This image was taken from Google Earth, and it's some desert I think in Colorado. So as you can see, these textures look real at every scale. You don't get blurring when you zoom in. So one more thing that we can do is to hallucinate detail. I will show you another video for that. So in this case, you will probably recognize a place. It was taken from Google Earth. Also the first frames, and the detail was hallucinated. So of course, this part is synthetic. It doesn't come from the satellite. Now it will zoom again but in the grass this time. You will have to wait a little bit. So, OK, those are our results. Now let me tell you how we did that. So this is a rough outline of what we did. First, we include in the top part of the pyramid those frames taken from Google Earth. And then for the last frame, the last real image that we got, we associated a segmentation that divided that into different classes. That image tells us that this is grass, this is path, this is some kind of stone. And for each of those classes, we have an associated texture. These are pictures that, contrary to those were not taken in place. These were taken somewhere else. These two actually were taken in place because it was easy, but this one is grass taken somewhere else. Okay? And not only that, we have to tell the algorithm that these textures look like that at this scale, so that the algorithm will propagate this part up, the detail. It will downsample the images to the correct scale that we want, and it will also push down the details from this image to get the images that you saw in the texture, in the video. We repeat that for each frame until we get here, where we have another keyframe. We call these keyframes. And so these are details corresponding to each of the textures. This, you may recognize, is the desert in Colorado that we put to add detail to this texture. And going into more detail, how we do this jump. So we start with the texture and its segmentation at the upper level.
Everything's working now.
OK, thank you. So we crop the central part, and we double the resolution of that to get these two images. Then we have to split the image using the segmentation into each of the three classes that will be processed separately. And then after a step that I will tell you later, we have to transfer the texture from the images, from the samples to the images where we need them. Okay? But before that, we have to match the color for this to work better, for this step to work better, the texture transfer. We have to match the color and unmatch it again to recover the original color in the frame. After that, we just put the parts together to get the finished frame, which has the texture now. And we proceed to the next frame of the video. Going into a little more detail, and you can stop me at any time if you have questions. Okay? Sure.
Do you align the direction of the bricks?
In that, I cheated in that case because I chose one that was like this. There is no way. The only information you have here is this image. And at that resolution, you cannot guess the direction of the bricks. So unless you know something else, you will have to guess something.
There are a lot of options there. And one is to get the orientation of the bricks from the orientation of the boundaries surrounding it. So in that case, you could line the bricks up.
Yeah. But for example, in this case, if you ask me how to put bricks in here, where we have two boundaries, you have to guess something. But anyway, probably, unless you know the place, any orientation will look good if in a case like that. So the first step shown there in the arrow, which was to double the resolution of the labels. We can have done what Lance just explained, but we did something simpler that works in this particular case. If you don't do something like that, you will get a boundary like this, which won't look good when you zoom in. We wanted something like this. And for that, what we did was to smooth independently each region. This is a profile of a cat around here. So we smooth independently each region and then assign to each pixel the label that has higher value, the highest value. Okay. That's how we constructed the labels. Then for the texture transfer, what we did was use a generalization of the algorithm proposed by Efros and Lung. And that algorithm works by first constructing a dictionary. For that, we scan all the training sample, the training texture, with a window. And we apply the function from that neighborhood to get some value that we'll store here. And we store also the corresponding center color associated with it. And in this way, we construct the dictionary, but by moving that window all over the sample. Once we have that dictionary, we want to transfer this texture to this image that was computed by interpolating from the upper level to add the detail to make it look like this. And so for that, what we do is we move this window all over the image in this order. And at each pixel, we take a neighborhood around it. We apply the same function. That will give us a value. We look for the closest match in the dictionary. We get, in that way, the color that we put here in this pixel, and we move to the next pixel. That's a whole algorithm to transfer the texture. Okay? This is really important. This algorithm is fundamental in image processing. So if you have questions, this.
When you say closest, how do you determine what the closest?
Nearest Euclidean distance. Yeah, this is a vector. You get another vector from here. You just, yes?
What's the window size?
In their algorithm, I think they use 9 or 11. We are using much smaller. We are using 6.
6 pixels?
6 by 6. So what they used was simply a concatenation of the values in the causal part of the window, meaning the part that was already touched by the algorithm. So they used this part here, and they weighted it using a Gaussian window. And because they use only the causal part, they cannot use the user input. This would be the user input for the texture transfer. So you want this part to guide the synthesis here. But since they only use the pixels that they already overrode, they cannot make use of this user input. So this is relatively slow because searching in this dictionary for when the dimension of these vectors is high, it's very slow. And this tends to blur the details of the images.
So wouldn't this just tile your training texture over the pattern? Because the next spot in the training texture would be the best match for.
If you just cut squares and you put like that, you mean?
Well, if you're looking for the best match will be the next spot in the training texture. So
Okay.
it would end up tiling, right?
Okay, you're ahead of me. I will tell you that. So for some textures, in particular for natural textures that are the one we are interested in, Ashik Means propose what you are saying, right? Instead of looking at this point in the dictionary, you use the neighbors, the information that your neighbors are providing. So let's say this pixel was filling from this position, and so this pixel votes for this pixel here because it's in the same relationship here and here. So this pixel votes for this. These two were filled by these two, so these two vote for this, and the same for that one, vote for that one. So instead of searching the whole dictionary, you only have to search for the match in these 3 candidates, and that's much faster. Now you compare this neighborhood with these 3 neighborhoods. Okay? When you do that, I forgot to say something. Ashik means first initialize this with random location. So he will, for each location here, he will assign a random location in the training sample. Okay, and then do this. If you do this, you end up with blocks like this, right? Instead of copying one pixel and pixels all over, you will copy continuous blocks, okay? The lines are only to show the blocks, right? You will get blocks that are big, right? And that has two advantages. First, it maintains structure. For example, flowers here, they are not cut into small pieces. They are kept complete. You don't get blurring because of that. But also because these boundaries are irregular, are hard to notice. And this is very fast. And another advantage is, since Ashik means uses non-causal windows, he's using user input, which we need for that to work. We need this part to guide the texture that we are creating. And he showed that if you repeat that pass several times, you get better performance because these blocks tend to enlarge, and small blocks tend to disappear. Another improvement that was suggested by Hertzman is to use, instead of looking for one patch or the other using the two different methods, was to use both of them at the same time and keep the best one. And they define the best one as, of course, if you just measure the Euclidean distance to the patches in the dictionary, Efros and Lung will be better than Ashik means because these patches are included there. But they say if this is not too much worse than the patch found by Efros, then let's use that because you will maintain bigger blocks. The important part in my view of this is that they observe that a lot of image operations can be framed as special cases of almost this same framework, like image denoising, texture synthesis and transfer, super resolution, almost in painting. The difference in all those operations is how you define the function that maps from the patch to the space where you do the comparison between patches. So that's an important part, how to define this function. This function must encode all the information that you need to predict the color of the central pixel. So, for example, one thing that is important to predict that color would be the colors of the pixels surrounding that. You want to know if there is an edge crossing that pixel. You want to know the gradient, in what direction it goes. But if there are things that don't provide you with information, you shouldn't include them because then it's harder to find in the dictionary. You are overfitting. There are other problems. So the things that we use to define this function, we first use that we are very sensitive to changes in the luminosity, but we are not as sensitive to changes in the color, in the chroma. So we gave different weights to those parts. The luminosity has a bigger weight. And also, we have to define where to use a causal versus a non-causal windows. For example, when we first, in the first pass of the algorithm, when we are searching here, since this part doesn't have high frequencies, if we search for this patch like it is, we were biasing ourselves to find patches in the dictionary that don't have high frequencies. So instead of growing the texture we want, we will grow some blurred texture. And so for that, we have to use this part downsample. We want to find some patch in the dictionary that, when downsample, looks like this. But for this part, we want to keep the continuity of the higher part. If there is an edge coming here, we don't want to downsample it. We want to continue the edge. So we have to use, as I will tell you here, we have to use both parts. So our final algorithm has 3 passes. The first one, we do a pass of Efros and Leung using only the mean color of the patch and the luminance gradient. And that is very fast because the dimension of that function is very low. It's only 5. In the second pass, we use Ashik means, which is very fast. And for that, we downsample the color in 2. And then we use, you cannot see it, but we use only the causal part of the luminance to keep the high frequencies, but only in the luminance part, because it's what you can perceive. And in the third pass, we downsample the color of the patch, of the whole patch, but we only include the YQ components of the IQ component of the YIQ, and then include the whole luminance. That imposes much more coherence that Ashik means doesn't care about it because he doesn't have to show all the frames. He only shows the last frame, but we need more coherence between the frames. And that produces better results than either Ashik mean or Efros, but runs in the same time as Ashik means. So it's much faster. And the last step that I have to tell you about is what I said. It's important to equalize the colors before searching the dictionary. Otherwise, for example, in this case, if I'm looking for a patch here and I look in this dictionary, instead of searching the whole dictionary, what it will find is on these parts of the image that are very dark. And so we are wasting almost the whole dictionary. So for that to work well, we have to equalize the colors before doing the texture transfer and do that transformation after the texture transfer. And the last thing is that if we just apply that, there will be very small differences between consecutive frames. And when you show those frames one after the other, you will notice that. So what we do is now we go in this direction, and we take this frame and put it in the center of the frame above. Okay? But some people may complain that that will modify the data that you are given. But the modification is so small that I guess you couldn't notice anything in the video I showed you. We don't blur the edges of that square or do anything else. OK, motivation. So what do you do beyond the available resolution? In some cases, if you have some external source that can tell you this is grass, or this is a street, or this is corn, then you can apply what I showed you and add the detail. According to the National Agricultural Statistical Services, 10% of the whole US area is covered by these 4 crops. So those are regular textures that we can predict. Thank you. That's all. Yes?
Are there any textures that are particularly difficult for this technique to utilize?
Ashik means is particularly adapted to natural textures. So for example, regular textures like bricks in the path I showed that has yellow bricks, it's a worst case example for Ashik means. But you can substitute Ashik means for something else and apply the rest of the algorithm, and it should work. Yes?
I still don't understand how you could run faster having 3 steps of two different types of algorithms rather than just one of any one of those.
OK.
Can you explain, are you simplifying?
Sure. No, because.
Repeat the question.
Sorry?
Repeat the question.
OK, how can we run faster than Efros and Leung if one of our stages is precisely Efros and Leung? The thing is, if you want only to do that, you will have to use a window size much bigger. You will have to use this kind of window size that we use here, which is 6 by 6 or more. And if you do that in Efros and Leung, you will have to search every time in the dictionary, and that will be very slow. If you use 6 by 6, you will have 36 pixels. Each one has 3 colors, so it's 100 and something dimensional vector. Okay? But what we are doing is, in the first stage, we only use 5-dimensional vectors so that the search in the dictionary is very fast. And then we apply this, that it's very fast, as it means it works fast with bigger windows. Does it make sense?
But the second one is 6 by 6 anyway.
Yeah, but this is fast. We do us in the same order as this. We don't do faster than this, but this is already fast. We do faster than image analogies that I mentioned before, which has FROS inside, so runs slow.
More questions?
Yeah.
So, won't all the graphs look the same if you do this?
You can have different dictionaries for different grasses. So you can include them as different classes. If you can get a segmentation that will tell you this is this kind of grass and this is this kind of grass, then you can make each one look like they should. There's someone first.
Conventional wisdom with graphics cards is that they come with a massive amount of memory to support textures. This almost looks like a texture compression technique where you can really stretch out your textures. Do you see applications like implementing it in hardware, or even in such cases as mid-mapping, where you're not looking straight down, but you have something coming at you, and very close becomes very blurred, and far away becomes like too jagged? Are there relevant applications in that direction?
Sure. I mean, if you can paint different surfaces, but not just with a texture, but telling it this is a material that looks like this at this scale and looks like this at this scale, then maybe you can put that into the graphic card and make it look as it should at each scale using this. That's of course one application. Lance?
I wanted to mention, in reply to an earlier question, that even if you use the same canonical grass everywhere, you've got different colors of grass and different shades of grass from the low frequency information from satellite. So those logs won't all look the same, even if you use the same pattern. That's not necessary.
Yeah, also, so from here you can see that even here you have diversity that can be used to generate different grasses if you want. Yeah, yes?
I wonder what your thoughts are on something like street views. I mean, I guess the kind of naive version of what I'm thinking might be that we start looking at the globe and then we zoom into a picture of the facade of some building or something. So I wonder if you have any thoughts on that.
I think the bottleneck is to get a good segmentation. If you get a good segmentation, then you can do this. Yeah.
Something that I think would come up there that probably wouldn't come up looking down would be text. I was wondering how your algorithm might deal with text.
I didn't get you.
With text, it seems like that would be a pretty hard case actually to go in infinitely deep on text, because text seems to have its own statistics, and when you zoom in, it doesn't really have that.
Yeah. I tried this with textures that have different statistics at different levels, and it's like this will uniformize the statistics, and you will get something that looks fractal. It looks good, but if you know what to expect, for example, in grass, you know that at some point you don't get more grass. You get a leaf or cells or something. So, but it will look fractal. Yes?
So I guess I missed the first part where you talked about segmentation. How do you do that segmentation? How many classes do you use, and how do you know that?
Now, in this case, we simply did it by hand. But we know that there are some segmentations provided by agricultural services that say this is corn, this is wheat. But that wasn't the focus of our talk.
How would you do it?
Well, if you can get
not necessarily for agricultural, but for just
one possibility is to use texture classification, but your segmentation will be as good as your texture classification algorithm. Yeah.
So if you combine all the dictionaries of different textures together, can you do it without segmentation?
Yes, you can. What you're doing there is kind of immersing the segmentation in the matching in the dictionary. So, but everything depends on how good is your the segmentation that you can get. If you can get a really good segmentation from an external source, then it's better to use that. Now, if you don't, then you can give that task to the dictionary. But you may get surprised there. Yes?
When you're propagating texture from the bottom up, do you use information from the layer immediately below or further down?
Let me go to that slide. So here. No, since you don't have texture assigned to these layers, the last layer you have assigned is this one. Not the last, but the first one that you find when you go deeper. So you propagate the texture from here up. I mean,
for the layer above the first layer.
For this one.
So for let's say several layers up, do you use only the layer immediately below it, or do you use several layers below?
So the layers, when I start here, I know that I have texture for this layer and for this layer. I don't use this one because I know that this one should integrate to this one. So if it doesn't, then there is a problem there, or the animator or the one who designed the texture wanted it to look like this and not like this integrated. Also, if I integrate this one, let's say I integrate this one to get to here, those are like 9 octaves. This will be reduced 500 times. So it's better to use this one that it's much bigger.
So for each layer, you only use the layer immediately below?
Not the one immediately below, because I don't have texture here.
Well, I mean, you build it up. So like each layer you build up.
Yeah. I feel from this, I feel all the ones that I don't have, but downsampling accordingly, right? I don't just use that texture. I use that one here, but I don't sample by 2 here, and so on.
What happens when the texture is really non-uniform? You took that picture of the authors instead of the grass picture, and you ran it through the algorithm. What sort of, does it just look fractal, or does it try to reproduce like pieces of faces and things like that?
In the particular case with these parameters,
Yeah, like there, if you took the face there instead of the grass.
So in this particular case, here we use a very small function there. So it will depend a lot of that. In this particular case, you will get a fractal kind of texture from that. If you include more, if you include bigger blocks there, you may get parts of faces and go deeper with that. OK. Thank you.